Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second annual International eConference on Atheism. My name is Dr. Darren Slade, and I'm the president of the Global Center for Religious Research, which is hosting this year's academic conference. Now, something to keep in mind is that GCRR is not interested in converting or deconverting anybody from any particular belief system. We are strictly an academic institution, and we seek to approach the discussion of God and suffering purely from a scholastic standpoint, whether that standpoint is theistic, atheistic, or something else entirely. Now, that's actually, in fact, one of the greatest things about GCRR is that you're being joined by students, scholars, and specialists from all over the world with a whole bunch of different backgrounds and traditions, right from the comfort and safety of your own home. Also, as a special gift to everybody, all you have to do is go to gcrr.org, our website, and look up our newest publication called God and Horrendous Suffering. And with that, all you have to do is scroll down to the bottom, and you can download a special sneak preview of the book by clicking the preview button. And if you end up wanting to purchase that book, we do recommend that you go through the GCRR website because our prices are a lot lower. But also, we're going to give you 15% off more than on the retail price. All you have to do is use the promo code SUFFERING, and that's all in lowercase. Use the promo code SUFFERING at checkout. I'd like to introduce to you my very good friend and our next presenter, Mr. Luke Hillman. Allow me to share my screen so that I can give a proper introduction. So, Luke Hillman's presentation today is going to be The Bigger Problem of Evil, Evaluating Stump's Account of Suffering with the Doctrine of Hell. Luke is a doctoral candidate at the University of Arkansas. He works primarily on issues of religious language, Wittgensteinian philosophy of religion, and philosophy of language. He teaches classes at multiple institutions on ethics, medical ethics, critical thinking, and logic. And his interests in the problem of suffering and the problem of evil actually span back to his undergraduate days when he was taking philosophy classes. We are so excited to have you here and present, and we're excited that one day we'll be able to call you Dr. Hillman. With that, sir, you have the floor.
Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Slade. I am very excited to present this paper and very eager to hear feedback. Also, I thank you for choosing to attend my presentation. You can follow along with the paper. There's a link, I think, dropped in chat or will be dropped in chat. So if you decide to follow along. The title of my paper is The Bigger Problem of Evil, Evaluating Stump's Account of Suffering with the Doctrine of Hell. In Wandering in Darkness, Eleanor Stump grapples with the problem of having suffering in a world created by a perfectly loving God. Stump presents her strategy for understanding these contrary notions by working through the narratives of the Bible in which suffering and a loving God are key features. Stump claims that there's a special type of knowledge that is acquired through stories alone, something that we cannot acquire simply through analytical argumentation. On Stump's account of suffering, the sufferer in some way is better because of her suffering and the experience gained from the story of her suffering. So, in this paper, I plan on expounding on each of these rich notions that Stump presents to her readers. I will address what it means for there to be two accounts of knowledge and how one of these accounts aids us to understand personal suffering. After explaining these accounts of knowledge, I give brief motivations for what it means to be a loving God and why that God would possibly allow suffering, accompanied by some specifics from the narrative of Job. With these examples and her unique account of knowledge, Stump presents a response to the problem of suffering. I will rehearse this response and analyze it. Stump's defense of her response to suffering is quite unique in the literature, and that's why I find it so compelling as a topic of study. Looking at the problem of suffering from an alternative perspective is refreshing and challenging. In the final section of this paper, I turn to the doctrine of hell, the ultimate suffering, and determine if Stump's defense can be extended to a much larger problem, as she seems to think, as well as consider some objections to her defense of suffering that are presented in the final part of her book. Stump begins her book with the discussion of two types of knowledge, Dominican and Franciscan. Stump's labeling of these two types of knowledge is based on her personification of two historical church figures. Both church fathers had a unique approach to converting people to faith. Dominican knowledge is based on the idea of using argumentation to convert people to the faith. Essentially, this type of knowledge consists of facts and propositional sentences. For example, my Dominican knowledge about my wife consists in me knowing her birthday, her favorite television show, and what makes her smile. In its entirety, my Dominican knowledge about my spouse could be given in a long list of propositions. For Stump, Dominican knowledge is the type of knowledge that we acquire through our beliefs. It's our propositional that-p knowledge that analytic philosophy is all too familiar with. On the other hand, Franciscan knowledge is knowledge that we gain from our experience of others that cannot quite be qualified like our propositional knowledge. I know what it is like to be around my wife and what it means to make her happy, but these notions are not as tangible as my knowledge of her birthday and parental relationships. For Stump, this other account of knowledge is knowledge that we acquire by experience, and only by experience, Franciscan knowledge. To highlight this distinction, consider a recent hire of your institution learning during the onboarding process. There is no doubt a significant amount of training material that the individual is required to undergo. Policies, Title IX, HR procedures, etc. Through the process of this onboarding, they are learning as much propositional knowledge as they can about working for your company. However, there is something entirely different that they learn when they finally start the position. The trainee learns what it is like to work at that institution. For Stump, this knowledge acquired from experiencing the job is entirely distinct from what the trainee learned just watching training videos. It is Franciscan knowledge only gained by living the experience. Importantly, for Stump's defense, narratives are the best source for Franciscan knowledge. It is what she refers to as a second-person knowledge that is being conveyed through telling of a story. Quote, "The story thus contributes to our having and learning from something like a second-person experience. Only it is our experience with the character of the story," end quote. When we read or hear stories, we gain an intimate knowledge of the character that is not possible through a lengthy list of propositions about that character. Thus, we learn what it is like to be Captain Ahab as he pursues the great Moby Dick. We know what it is like to slay giants with Don Quixote, and we understand what it is like to hunger and beg our way through the streets of London with Oliver Twist. As a reader, we are experiencing life with this character. Stump also holds that this experiential knowledge is lost if the story is converted into a first-person or third-person account. Plainly, we would struggle greatly to put our experience, this Franciscan knowledge, into Dominican type of accounts without losing some major details of our experience of that person. I believe we are now motivated to consider the problem of suffering from a narrative-based account. Suffering is too personal to evaluate through an analytical argument. Stump is correct that we should focus on the narratives of the Bible given in the Bible as they plainly walk through some of the most intense suffering that humans can undergo. However, before I turn to these narratives, or at least the narrative of Job, I will outline the notion of suffering and the problem of suffering if there is a perfectly loving God. Suffering is a bad thing. There's no need to give a specific example here because I think in virtue of just sharing in humanity, we have all felt the touch of suffering in our life, one way or another. In fact, Stump is compelled to say that her account of suffering that looks at 4 specific examples given in the Bible should still apply to any species of suffering. So, if we hold to the notion that there is a perfectly loving God, granted, that's a very big if, we must develop an account of why God would allow suffering. God is motivated for some reason to allow those he loves to suffer. Consider the mother whose child is in the ICU. Perhaps the specific treatment to cure her child will be extremely painful, not long lasting, but the pain will be intense for the child. We would not be bothered that the mother allows her child to go through such tremendous pain. In fact, we would probably consider it a trait of a good mother that the child is allowed to endure such suffering for their long-term benefit. Well, perhaps then God is in a similar frame of mind when suffering occurs. If it is true that God allows suffering for the betterment of the sufferer, what about specific instances when the suffering didn't end well, and the sufferer never sees an end to their suffering? The child did not live through the treatment, The Holocaust victim did not survive to tell her story. The expectant mother did not live through childbirth, etc. Also, if the suffering is intense, even if it brings about a good end, there is the problem of why an omnipotent God would have to obtain that good only via such painful means. If the mother of the previous paragraph could have had her child made well without going through such trauma, we'd think that she would have done that instead. Well, I want to table this question for now and return to it juxtaposed with the doctrine of hell, as I believe it becomes a fiercer objection to answer. For Stump, as the mother is allowing the child to suffer, so too God is allowing the person to suffer in virtue of God's love. If we are to reconcile God as loving and suffering to happen in a world, then we must give an account of God's love. For Stump, anyone who loves another has two desires: the betterment of the one they love and union with one they love. Importantly, for Stump's defense of suffering, the latter of these desires is stronger. So a perfectly loving God would want to be united with his creation above all else. Union is not just being in the presence of someone. Rather comically, Stump gives the example of a doctor in union with a comatose patient. It is obviously quite silly to consider the doctor in union with a non-responsive person who is completely unaware of the presence of the other. Union is about shared attention. We come to understand another by being attentive to that person. My wife would be indignant, to say the least, if we were spending time together and my focus was on my phone or some video game. In some true sense, I am there with her by sitting next to her on the couch, but I am not being attentive, a key requirement for Stump's idea of love. So God, like a good spouse, must be attentive to have the proper union he desires with his creation. However, union must involve both parties to be considered a proper and fulfilling union. When it comes to our side of the union, the ball is truly in our court. Stump's understanding of our contribution pivots heavily on Aquinas' treatment of our will. Simply put, there is something wrong with our will. If our will were functioning properly, as intended at creation, we would constantly seek out union with God. This is what Aquinas calls the upright will. But as we are part of humankind, meaning descendants from Adam and Eve, our will is tainted and eternally divided as a result of the original sin. Stump refers to this as, quote, a sort of cancer of the will, a proneness to evil that eventuates in moral wrongdoing sooner or later, end quote. Now, with a broken will, we want to fulfill our carnal desires and we want to be with God. We are motivated to be involved in two entirely separate unions. Stump holds that God is attempting to rectify our mismatched wills through the avenue of suffering. Stump also claims that the sanctification of the will cannot be entirely involuntary. God, because he is loving and wants genuine union with us, cannot manipulate our will. Like any virtuous and loving relationship, consent is required. If God did manipulate our will, it would be a violation of his goodness. So God permits suffering. Allowing the elimination of the current desires of our heart through suffering then allows us to see the true intended desire of our heart to be in perfect union with our loving God. The redemption of the sufferer occurs based upon the degree to which they are willing to return from this, quote, internal alienation, end quote. For me, an immediate concern arises here when considering how God uses suffering to upright our will. To some extent, put roughly, it seems as if God is just torturing us until we consent to love him. Well, Stump would probably respond to this immediate worry by leaning into God's nature, primarily God's love. Also, I think if Stump's point about Franciscan knowledge is true, there really is no other way to gain the flourishing and knowledge from suffering other than living the experience. Stump rehearses the story of Job to animate her connection with narratives and her defense of suffering. As we know, Job is blessed among men. He has several kids, substantial wealth, friends, and a loving wife. However, God allows Satan to take all of that away. In Job's pursuit to understand God's rationale, he questions God and his motivation for allowing one as devout as himself to come to such hardships? Through this intense questioning, God reveals something to Job. Quote, God explains Job's suffering to Job, not by giving him knowledge that, but by giving him Franciscan knowledge of persons with respect to God. End quote. Job comes to understand God's motivation through God's reminder of his power and purpose. Job's will became refocused on God through God's second person account of his own reasoning for allowing Job to suffer. Job learns the story of why God allowed him to suffer and gained better understanding of his own position. Despite Job losing everything, he still ends up desiring, much more strongly, to be in union with God. Thus, Job flourishes. This should not be considered, as might be tempting, a manipulation of Job's will. Rather, God allows Satan to do what he desires to Job. God, as the story goes, does allow Satan to torment Job with the hopes that Job will become closer to God. In the end, through God's explaining Job's suffering to Job and his allowance of this suffering, Job comes to desire a closer union with God. It is not until the end of the story that God can finally explain why he allowed the suffering. Stump notes that if God were to do so prior to the suffering, it would weaken, or perhaps cease, all redemption of the will. Quote, the reason that justify God's allowing human suffering are also the reasons that justify God's failing to explain to those reasons to the sufferer. End quote. Stump's defense of suffering is powerful, but it is not without some shortcomings. We still need to understand cases of suffering in which the result is not as redemptive as Job's. What should we say about wills that are never restored? Wills that never become upright and rectified per their original created purpose. To preserve Aquinas' work on the will and Stump's presentation for God's desired union with his creation, I chose an account of eternal damnation that is most cognizant of human free will, the mild account of hell. I do not think that the severity of eternal suffering is relevant to this objection. Rather, what matters is that the suffering is to some extent unending. So, if we have an upright will that God creates in us that manifests a desire to be with God, then, to a strong degree, any separation from God, not even necessarily eternal, results in our suffering. Our will is without something that it is created to desire and love. Any time apart from the beloved is to suffer. Compared with the accounts of suffering given in Stump's work, eternal damnation is unique because it is after the death of the sufferer. Their human suffering has ended, their wills still have not been realigned back to God, and thus they go to hell. With the case of Job, God grants allowance to Satan to interfere in Job's life and ruin it. Per my understanding of any account of hell, it does seem that God is more partisan towards submitting his creation to eternal punishment as a result of something in this creation's life. In C.S. Lewis and J.L. Wall's mild account of hell, humanity has an option to choose to be reconciled with God, but some refuse this reconciliation because of an internal struggle of their desire. Their wills pull them away from the beloved and towards the carnal. Wall's and Lewis's account of hell is most intriguing and fruitful because, for Wall's, we have an incompatibilist free will, meaning that our future is not determined and we make our own choices. For some, this incompatibilist claim is enough to dismiss this mild hell view outright. Essentially, on a mild account of hell, there is no way that God can guarantee that we eventually choose him. If God were to manipulate us to choose him, he would be in violation of his loving nature. Wall's incompatibilist understanding of free will meshes with God's desired union with us because if God knew who would ultimately realign with him, he would only pursue those individuals. Again, we cannot force our union upon someone. In a sense, there must be an action of consent for the union to be complete and whole. Per the mild version of the doctrine of hell, hell is locked from the inside. The suffering, or eternal suffering, is not physical, it's psychological. there's an internal suffering between one's desire to be in control and one's desire to be with God. For Lewis and Walls, in hell, we are constantly given the choice to choose God. However, if we choose hell and separation from God, we still have the option to leave hell. The choice is not something that only happens once. For Walls, if there is always a choice to refuse God, some will always choose to refuse God. Lewis says that we are motivated by our own pride to constantly reject God. We want a feeling that we are in control. To choose God is an admission that we lack that control. So, even for Walls' mild account of hell, there is a prevalent case of suffering. If we are to hold Aquinas' account of the upright will, as Stump presents it, then for the human who constantly rejects God, this person is suffering internally. Their true nature desires something that is smothered by their pride and desire to be autonomous. Of course, God could remove these warring desires as he is omnipotent. However, to do so would be in direct violation of his desire to be in union with his beloved, because he cannot force union. Still, those who suffer because they constantly reject God for eternity seem to have no positive reconciliation of their suffering. Even if one individual chooses to remain in hell, they will continue to suffer and deprive themselves of their intended flourishing with God. If the point of suffering, at least in a world with a perfectly loving God, is the betterment of the sufferer, what redemption is there for the constant rejecter? Well, some could answer this question in a few ways. First, on this mild account of hell, the doors are closed from the inside. It is up to the damned to choose God, but the constant rejection of God is at the hands of the sufferer. This fact about Walls and Lewis' version of hell would not be inconsistent with Stump's defense of suffering. Stump might also say, as I believe Lewis and Walls to claim, that this sort of hell is self-imposed. Because there is always the option to choose God, it is not comparable to cases of suffering in which the sufferer had no choice. Above, I explained that God desires the consenting beloved in order for their union to be proper. It is obviously not as if Job checked a ballot that he would like to now suffer. C.S. Lewis says it best, quote, "To be a complete man means to have the passions obedient to the will, and the will offered to God. To have been a man, to be an ex-man or a damned ghost, would presumably mean to consist of a will utterly centered in itself and passions utterly uncontrolled by the will," end quote. While this chosen doctrine of hell does not immediately appear inconsistent with Stump's defense, I believe that a more intense view of hell, such as the traditional view of hell, could prove inconsistent. In further work on Stump's defense of suffering, I would like to apply such a consideration. After considering my primary objection of the doctrine of hell and Stump's probable rebuttal, I want to look at a few brief objections that Stump herself addresses at the end of her book. These objections are not meant to be exhaustive, but to hopefully curb some initial worries in thinking about Stump's defense of suffering. The first objection I want to think about more is the narrowing of scope. Typically, when discussing God and suffering, it is much easier to keep the scope focused on suffering generally. But when we get to the specifics, as I was hesitant to do in my initial explanation of the problem, it gets a lot trickier. Like the problem of evil, when considering evils that are completely gratuitous, looking at specific instances of suffering, especially unresolved suffering, can begin to put some holes in the sails. However, Stump does address this concern nicely, or at least cleverly, in saying that her defense of suffering is simply meant to account for the suffering which she addressed in her narrative. Quote, "On the Thomistic defense, even the worser and most apparently hopeless suffering has the point," end quote. This response would not comfort the suffering individual, no doubt, but it does offer some hope that individual suffering is tailored specifically to their subsequent flourishing. An alternative objection to Stump's defense could say something about how her defense requires one to admit and accept specific theological truths about God. Admittedly, you could claim that baked into her defense of suffering is strong theological notion notions about God's nature, love, and power, and thus anyone who hopes to flourish from their suffering must hold to these truths. For Stump and Aquinas, this is a step in the wrong direction. Quote, "In my view, to know that one's life, even in its suffering, is a gift, and to know that it is a gift of love is already to know the giver, even if in an unacknowledged way and to a very limited extent." End quote. When Job questioned the justification of God's allowance of his suffering, God made it clear that Job could not even understand the ways of God if he tried. It is not necessary to know the specifics of God to understand the purpose of suffering and to flourish. This response strongly resonates with how Kierkegaard treated God's love in Fear and Trembling. Quote, "I am convinced that God is love. When it is present to me, I am unspeakably happy. When it is absent, I long for it more vehemently than the lover for the object of his love. But I do not have faith. This courage I lack. To me, God's love, in both the direct and the converse sense, is incommensurable with the whole of actuality." End quote. To Kierkegaard's point, the specifics of the lover are not necessary to feel the effects of the love. The unaddressed gift is still a gift. Another worry should be raised about God's distance from the suffering. In my initial explanation of suffering and Stump's defense, it is a key feature that God does not tell the individual the purpose of their suffering. When considering the whole picture, this could be analogous to an athletic coach not explaining the specifics of the drills assigned to the team in practice. Alternatively, one could be compelled to see that this is a calloused approach to human flourishing. Namely, if God is all powerful, why wouldn't there be a way to flourish in which the individual knew and understood the process of their flourishing? Stump responds to this objection by reminding the reader of God's omnipresence. While the suffering beloved goes through the throes of life and their suffering, God's love is still present throughout until the flourishing is complete. The question of why God is not immediately present to console the sufferer throughout their suffering is a much larger question about the hiddenness of God, which obviously space does not permit addressing here. In this paper and presentation, we have looked at Stump's defense of suffering allowed by a perfectly loving God. To present this defense, we consider her alternative accounts of knowledge and how there is a unique knowledge acquired through the experience of the individual that cannot be obtained through strict propositional knowledge. We also looked at the Bible's primary example of suffering, Job, and how this knowledge is acquired through the narrative. I presented an objection that considered a contemporary version of hell with some suffering, and while Stump's defense held against the specific version of the doctrine of hell, it is not clear that cases of hell in which God directly permits the suffering to unwilling individuals would likewise leave her defense unblemished. Even after considering some of Stump's own objections, I can tell that my understanding of her treatment of suffering needs room to grow. There is no doubt that the obstacle of seeing suffering, any suffering, as entirely pointless is a big hill to climb. Hopefully, my presentation of Stump's defense and subsequent objections helped to shift the needle a bit in the other direction. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Hillman. I really appreciate you taking a more critical approach to this. You've not only presented what could be potential answers, potential discussion points, but you've also said, hold on, let's take a look at this. You didn't just buy right into it, which I like. So I guess my first main question, you sort of answered it at the end, but did Stump succeed in their theodicy or as a whole, or do you think it is as a whole a failure?
Well, to be rather blunt, to completely recheck and check this work would be very exhausting. This book is like 700 pages long, and as I am a doctoral candidate, I have
one last thing you might want to know is that the Global Center for Religious Research has established the most comprehensive international research group to study the causes, manifestations, and treatment options for those suffering from religious trauma. But we have a big problem. See, in order for victims of religious trauma to receive help, we need to arrive at a place in our culture where religious trauma is recognized as a real mental health condition. And unfortunately, the academic study of religious trauma is still in its infancy. This means that there are no exhaustive empirical studies to support what we have seen and experienced, that religious trauma exists and is a chronic problem. As it stands, really only anecdotal case studies have been published so far, but nothing substantially empirical. And GCRR wants to correct this gap of knowledge, and we're hoping to get your help with that. So we have set up a GoFundMe page in order to crowdsource the world's very first, most comprehensive sociological study on the existence, causes, and manifestations of religious trauma. Now, the reason we are crowdsourcing this stuff is because we were actually set to get a grant, federal grant for this research project, and then the federal government halted all funding for mental health research. So we were left holding the bag. That's why we're hoping the public can join us in this effort. All you have to do is go to GoFundMe.com and search for the phrase religious trauma sociological study, or you can click the link that I'm going to put in the chat box. And at the very least, please share this GoFundMe page across all your social media platforms just to get the word out about this really important research project.